they might be trickling in. Hi, I'm Alice Marwick. I'm a professor in communication and media studies, and I direct a research center at Rose Hill called the McGannon Center. And the McGannon Center studies the social and ethical implications of communication technologies. So we look at everything from social media sites to video games to information policy. And we have this ongoing lecture series called the Technology and Society Lecture Series that brings scholars from around the country and around the world to campus to talk about different aspects of how new technology is changing our lives. And today I am thrilled to have Jessie Baldwin-Philippi, who is also a professor in CMS, and she will be acting as the respondent and introducing our speaker today, Sam Woolley. So thanks for you all for coming, and if you're interested in the McGannon Center, next semester we're going to be kicking off a bunch of research initiatives that involve undergrads. The website is McGannonCenter.com. All right, thank you.
Okay, and so I am happy to introduce Sam Woolley. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in the Department of Comm Studies there. And he's also affiliated with their Center for Civic Communication and also the Technology Policy Lab there. So he's the project manager of a project called the Political Bots Project at University of Washington, which he will obviously be talking to us today about. But he's also interested kind of largely in the internet, in internet governance and internet policy and digital activism as well. So we are happy to introduce him.
So thank you both for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to be here talking about bots. Like Jessie said, my research looks at the political role of sort of social technology. And so some of you might be wondering sort of what a bot is, and that's a completely valid question because up until around 3 years ago, I didn't really know what a bot was. So we'll start off kind of simply. A bot is basically a software program that automates tasks on the internet. So what a bot does is you write a code, and then it can do anything from scraping the web for information for you to sort of like curating your email, deciding what's spam and what's not. But also, bots can be socially oriented. So there's these things called social bots, basically. Social bots have frontline communication with people. So a social bot kind of looks like a real user on a platform like Twitter or Facebook or Reddit, and can tweet messages or send messages and interact with other human users on the site. So it's kind of crazy. It's like this automated robot account. What I'm really interested in, and the team I work with, is political bots. And we've kind of coined this term. It's not too far of a stretch, you can see. Political bots are basically social bots that have a political agenda. They are automated, and they tweet out things about politics, whether for good, maybe for democratic causes or for journalists who use them as information radiators, or for something more nefarious like sending out propaganda on behalf of an authoritarian regime or what have you. So I'll give you a little bit of a taste of what a political bot is and what a political bot does. And so the first case I'm going to talk about is the Ecuadorian case. The Ecuadorian case happened, I first kind of became acquainted with it about a year ago. I started getting text messages from a bunch of friends who were Ecuadorian, and my sister-in-law who's Ecuadorian, and they were saying there's a lot of weird stuff going on Twitter in Ecuador. We think that it's bots, we think it's these automated accounts because a lot of the messages are garbled, but we think it's coming from the Correa regime. We think it's political. Correa is the president of Ecuador. It's really trying to prevent anyone speaking out against Correa, and it's also like trying to popularize Correa, so spread propaganda about the government. We don't know though, maybe it could be real people, or it could be trolls paid by the government, or something like that. And so in the beginning I was a little bit skeptical, because you know, it's from my sister-in-law, and like I kind of treat tweets like, or text from her like a bot, kind of. But also, I was like interested. I was especially interested because everyday people were kind of interested in my academic work, which never happens. So I started doing a little bit of research. And I started chatting with some friends I had at Global Voices and talking to them. Global Voices is this basically online sort of magazine that talks about democracy and politics and control online and things like that. And I started doing some research. and I found out that the government was sending out bots. Punchline. Journalists had been following basically troll centers in Quito, in Ecuador, that were employing people, the government was employing people at these troll centers to send out pro-regime messaging. And so I was wondering, are there bots? And it turned out, yeah. So they're creating a bunch of proxy accounts on Twitter, or fake, to send out tons of automated messages on behalf of the government. Now, Correa's been really upfront about the fact that he's going to wage a social media campaign on behalf of his government and to get his name out there. This is just one step further, doing something that is basically behind the curtain, like cheating people in a way, like showing them messages that they think are from people that they might see on the street, but that are actually from the government. So this is just one case amongst over 100 that we've cataloged now. But I wanted to sort of let you know what's going on and like what the effects are for real people. So this kind of can prevent activism from happening because it spams people on Twitter that might be coordinating events, etc. It can also sort of promote the ideals of the government in a way that make them look more popular than they actually are, which can have an effect on public opinion and is kind of scary. Our research project has a pretty broad research question. Actually, it has tons of research questions, but traditionally you're only meant to have one. So this is it. What's the impact of political bots on public life? How do these automated accounts that look like people challenge or change public life? How do they affect behaviors? And also, how do they affect people's day-to-day? So I already talked to you a little bit about the Ecuadorian case. The Ecuadorian case is sort of a case of a repressive regime. I call it repressive mainly because a lot of things in my discipline are looking a little bit suspect, control of the media, etc. Lack of journalistic integrity, and also the jailing of lots of journalists recently. So the Ecuadorian case is a case of bots being used within a country by the regime on its own people. And it might filter out because we know that Twitter's transnational to other people as well. But it's mostly targeted at people in Ecuador, voting Ecuadorians. The next case is in Russia. All of you have probably heard about the crisis that was going on in the Ukraine in the last year or so. Basically, Russia was having issues, or was attempting to take the Crimea and did. And the Ukrainians didn't like that, surprisingly. Not surprisingly at all. And so lots of newspapers abroad were writing about this. The Guardian was one of them, Guardian's in the UK. Well, we started seeing a lot of spam traffic targeting the Guardian. All of the Guardian hashtags were being spammed. Basically, people were picking up the hashtag spamming thousands of times when a Guardian journalist would write an article. And the Guardian website was attacked. And it was traced back to the Russian government, to the Kremlin. And so what we saw there was a case of one government attacking institutions abroad using bots. The last case is kind of my favorite case. It's kind of a funny one, especially because I like US politics a lot. I think it was a couple years ago, during a midterm election, there was some weird Twitter accounts that were texting kind of code back and forth to each other that some people noticed. And they kind of triangulated them basically simply like you would too. They looked at their followers to see kind of who they were friends with, and they did a bit of what we call social network analysis. And they found that one of the accounts was owned by was operated by a super PAC, a conservative super PAC. And the other account was operated by a Republican congressional candidate. And we were really curious, what the heck's going on here? Why are they tweeting these numbers back and forth to each other? Why do they have these bot accounts tweeting numbers back and forth? Well, it turned out they were internal polling numbers. The campaigns were tweeting internal polling numbers to one another, the super PAC and the candidate. Now, some of you have heard of Citizens United. You probably know that campaign finance has changed a lot lately. But it's still illegal for coordination like this to happen, even though a lot of times it's overlooked. And so this is a really interesting case. What are the implications here? There's three implications I see broadly. And this is a working a working research project, so these could change. What we see is bots are being used by strict regimes, authoritarian countries, for social control in the country. They're also a transnational phenomenon, so Russia attacking institutions in Great Britain. And they're also being used by political actors in Western democracies. So this isn't just something that's happening in China or Russia. It's happening in the United States and Australia, etc. So, I think this provides kind of a nice segue into the project to give you guys a little bit of background about what we're trying to do here. This team that I work with is very transdisciplinary. It's not just a bunch of social scientists attempting to answer questions about things that go on in computers. Actually, the NSF grant that National Science Foundation grant that we originally got was offered to teams of computer and social sciences. I don't know if any of you guys do computer science or social science, but these two groups don't talk a lot. And there's also a lot of translation that's necessary when you start to look at algorithms and code and things going on online and attempting to make social claims. And so we have a bunch of we have a couple of computer scientists. Our co-PI, David McDonald, is one of them. He's the chair of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at University of Washington, which is kind of a mouthful, but they do all sorts of things to do with human-machine interaction. And then we also have Nora Bakader, who is a researcher at the Information School at UW, and she's actually currently in Qatar conducting fieldwork for us, interviewing bot makers and stuff. The PI of this project is a guy named Phil Howard. He's my advisor for my PhD, and he's just an awesome scholar. He basically came up with this idea and has been driving it along with me and David and Nora. So we have kind of a three-part research process. The research process is broken down into three parts because we wanted it to be multi-method, and we wanted to kind of get at the question of bots from multiple angles. So our big thing is how can we better understand what bots do using the methods that we have in our toolkit already, and maybe tweaking them a little bit. So the first thing we thought we could do is read all the different media articles that are out there. Like articles in England, I guess we're allowed to read articles in 8 or 10 different languages, including Mandarin, Russian. We have coders that are doing this, Spanish, French, English, Turkish. And so we're trying to read as many articles as possible. And so from this, we built sort of a comparative event data set. Anytime journalists write about a bot being used for political reasons, we basically entered into the data set, and we have people triple code it. The next way we thought we could answer questions about bots was to do international fieldwork, to talk to the people that actually make bots, and to talk to people that track bots for a living. It kind of sounds weird that people might track bots for a living, but places like Microsoft, Secure and Trustworthy Computing Division, or people at Twitter, or people at IBM want to know if there's bots on their sites, right? They all have different sort of terms of service, whether or not you can have bots, but they want to know. So we're interviewing those people, getting the people's perspective. The last thing we want to do is kind of think about this with other smart people. Build on what's come before, theory-wise, and further it a little bit by thinking about new socio-technical possibilities. So to recap a little bit, we're trying to use 3 methods. Theory building is its own kind of thing. We're also using fieldwork, qualitative case analysis, and we're doing some large data set analysis of the presidential elections right now, which is really exciting actually. So as you guys know, we have all these crazy candidates up there talking all the time. When I say crazy, I mean crazy. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. And so what we have the bots doing is tracking everything that's going on Twitter. Anytime someone says hashtag Donald Trump, anytime someone says something about Carson, anytime someone talks about Hillary Clinton, we are tracking all of that and amassing a massive data set to use in comparison with our qualitative work. So if bot makers and trackers say one thing, we can kind of look at the big data and do analysis and say, what does it say? What are we seeing here? How can we compare and contrast? So a little bit of background about the comparative database of global cases. We have 100+ cases. So we have cases taking place in over 40+ countries or so. Cases can occur in different countries, and the way that we're kind of defining a case is by saying, what was the crisis situation this bot was involved in? What was the election that was going on? Et cetera, et cetera. So in Ecuador, it's a little bit broader of a case. It's governmental repression, and we're coding that. And we're having some challenges with this, in fact. We have cases from all over the world. We have cases from all of these countries listed up here, and more. You'll notice that there is a wide range of countries, from Australia to China to Bahrain, and it's an ongoing process. In fact, we have a nominate a bot form on our website, politicalbots.org, where anyone can go and nominate a political bot. If they suspect that an account is a bot that is doing something political in any country, they can report it to us and we will go research it. It's kind of crowdsourcing the brain of the hive. And what we're trying to do with this is build a typology of bots. A lot of times people kind of don't understand all the different ways that bots are used, and this typology is a working typology. It's by no means exhaustive. We're trying to make it as simple as possible, though, so that we can fit bots into as many categories, or as few categories as possible. So, what type of political bots are there? This is kind of a binary, and it can be a little bit fuzzy. But basically, we have controllers and we have facilitators. Control bots are bots that are used typically by political actors to fake, manipulate, or jam discourse. They could be propaganda bots that send out messages on behalf of a politician or a regime. We've seen these in China. We've also seen these in the United States. They can be follower bots. Follower bots are a really kind of interesting phenomena, and a lot of you might have heard about celebrities that have 100,000 fake followers or something like that. There's articles that have been written about this. Or that Barack Obama has 70% fake followers. And it might seem a little mundane at first, but at the end of the day, what it does is subtly manipulate public opinion. Call it like vanity metrics, you know? Like someone can basically say, I'm popular, look at how many Twitter followers I have. And people will be like, yeah, I guess this person is a pretty popular politician. They have 1 million Twitter followers. But then if you go in the back and you look, it turns out that 80% of their followers are fake. In fact, Newt Gingrich, during the last presidential election, had about 95% fake followers. So he's a little old, I don't know if you guys know him, but it's probably because he's kind of a crappy Twitter user, honestly. And then there's gridlock bots. These ones are actually, to me, maybe the most interesting. Gridlock bots are like spam bots. They send spam, but they send spam that's targeted at activists and people trying to organize politically. We saw this a lot during the Arab Spring. And basically what was happening was people were using hashtag Tahrir Square in Egypt to organize themselves on Twitter or Facebook. And the Egyptian government got wise to this and started co-opting the hashtag and basically sending thousands of tweets so that no one could find what was actually going on. If someone's tweeting, meet me here, they were trying to silence the conversation. Then we have facilitator bots. Facilitator bots are kind of the good bots. They share, they spread, and they challenge discourse. Amongst these is journalism bots. I've talked to a lot of journalists actually, who consider themselves data journalists or sort of like tech journalists, and they're beginning to use bots a lot. A journalist's lucky if they can write 1 article a week, a good article, and a deep investigative report might take months. But a journalist comes across so many different things over the course of the day. So many possible stories. Well, what bots can do, because they can automate and because they can read data so fast, is they can act as what one journalist called an information radiator. They can send out all the news stories of new things that are going on. They can send out all the congressional voting records in a certain state. They can send out information on upcoming crises. And actually, bots have even been used to write articles. So there's something called QuakeBot. And basically what it does is, anytime what is it called, seismograph, or seismograph? Yeah. Puts out that there's an earthquake, the QuakeBot gets all the information, all the data offline, the time, the place, etc., and just writes a really simple article. The LA Times has published these, written by a bot. How do you deal with that byline? It's kind of weird, right? Then there's kind of protest bots. Protest bots are another thing altogether. Protest bots are basically written to generate a crowd surrounding a certain kind of issue. There's actually a great article, it's called What is a Protest Bot, written on Medium by a guy named, I think, Mark Sample, who's a professor. And it talks kind of about the way that bots can facilitate different types of protests. So during the Black Lives Matter events that are actually, obviously ongoing, someone has made a bot that tweets in support of Black Lives Matter and uses that hashtag. And next, there's activism bots. Activism bots are slightly different than protest bots, but related. To me, activism bots basically use Twitter as a platform for making an activist statement, for tracking what someone's doing that's in power. And so a good example of this is there's lots of Wikipedia bots that actually track any time someone in the New York Police Department makes a change to Wikipedia, and then they tweet it out. So if the New York Police Department goes in and tries to change Wikipedia, tries to change information that's accessible to the public, the bot lets people know. If there's one that's really great called Congress Edits, if anyone from a congressional IP address edits Wikipedia, it automatically tweets out, so-and-so, Bernie Sanders, changed this page in Wikipedia, which is interesting, It's keeping people accountable is the idea. So our field work, which is basically talking to people in and around cities like New York or in Turkey. We've been in Istanbul, we've been in Berlin, we've done some stuff in Spain. I'm heading to Ecuador soon, as you might imagine, because I have a lot of contacts there. What we're doing is we're kind of reconsidering what fieldwork has been without trying to reinvent it, but we're tweaking it for what we need. We're making some amendments. So it's kind of interesting. What does it mean to do fieldwork with people that make bots? And what does it mean to do fieldwork with bots? Because bots are kind of semi-human. People code them, but then they release them into the wild. And a lot of times, what I've heard from bot makers is, I made it, and then I let it do its own thing. And it did a bunch of stuff that I didn't expect it to do. So fieldwork turns out to be really interesting when you're trying to do fieldwork like what we call something ethnography of information, perhaps. You're trying to look at semi-human actors. We're talking to producers and consumers, as I mentioned. Those are the people involved. And we're trying to do around 85 interviews and 200 plus hours of participant observation. That's just a number. It could change. We've done a lot of interviews today. So, this is my favorite part, because it's actually the stuff that I do. I should mention that the project that we're doing was originally imagined in a conversation with my advisor, Phil Howard. We were kind of chatting, and I'm like, I think I really want to do my dissertation on bots. And specifically, I'm interested in doing field work of bots. Like, I want to study bots in the field. I want to do like ethnography of the people who make them, but I also want to look at bots and see what effect they have on the social sphere. And he's like, that might be kind of weird. People are going to accuse you of technological determinism, like just saying that tech makes all the changes. And so other people might worry that you veer towards social determinism, like worrying that society is what really matters. And so I kind of want to find this hot spot in the middle. How can we talk about technical actors in a way that is more nuanced? Like, there's a guy named Bruno Latour, and he does work on what he calls actants, thinking about things as having some kind of operationalization. They can do things. They can have an effect on society. Latour's a sociologist, so this is kind of an interesting idea. What we're trying to do is take this kind of a step further with the work of a lot of other people and say, what happens when human actors aren't necessarily the driving force of sociality? What happens when humans aren't the only people making social change? What happens when technical actors make social change? And what happens when these actors are technical in two senses? They're technology, but they're also technically human in the truest sense of the word. And that's a thing from Gina Neff, who I work with at the University of Washington. And so what I'm trying to do in my dissertation is basically generate theory about these ideas and talk about the history of how bots have been used. The second step of this is to look at methods for how we can study automation. I kind of gave you a background on what that looks like. I'm looking at kind of 3 cases at the moment, and these might change. This is kind of my layout right now. The Ecuadorian case is obviously something I'm really interested in, and I have a lot of contacts there, so I'd like to talk more to people in Ecuador. The US election's coming up, and obviously, like, how can I not study the US election? We've set up this big data analysis, but we also have access to so many bot makers and trackers and interesting bots here in the United States. And in fact, we're hosting a workshop in New York for the next week with a few select people on the conversation of bots in America, basically. Like, let's discuss all the different uses, from arts to journalism to politics. And the third case is a really interesting one. You might have heard about the anti-vaccine movement, and some of you have heard about the pro-vaccine movement. Well, what I wanted to do is track the way that bots were used in the issue campaign. And back in my first year of grad school, I was working with this guy named Tim Wong, who has this company called Pacific Social Architect Corporation. Very onerous sort of name. But basically what they do is look at the way that automation can be used in social circumstances. And Tim called me up and he's like, hey, I want to see how bots can be used to kind of spread information to a community that believes something that is contradicted by science. It's the fun. Okay. Anyway, so I want to see what bots can do to a community that believes something that is contradicted by science. And so he was kind of going with some other ideas like global warming, communities that were anti-global warming, flat Earth societies, and that exists, believe me. I listened to a YouTube video the other day of a guy claiming the Earth was flat, who my friend knew. Crazy. But he fell in the vaccine community. He's like, okay, let's send out a bunch of bots to the vaccine community. And I was like, okay, man, this sounds a little bit weird, like we're tampering with people and things. He's like, well, see if you can get what we call IRB, if you can get human subjects like to agree to this. And somehow I did. And so we decided to run a sort of like a little experiment on the Twitter community of anti-vaxxers. And we built a bunch of bots, and we sent them out, and had them talk to people who were anti-vaccine. The bots would engage in conversation by themselves. We coded them with a bunch of different words. They would also share articles. And the goal was to see if we could get anti-vaccine activists to talk about articles that were about the possible merits of vaccines, or why the anti-vaccine movement, which a lot of it's based on research of one guy who wrote a paper in Science in the 80s, and the paper was completely disproved and thrown out. Like, why maybe anti-vaccination stances need a little bit of rethinking. My team actually won the competition, which was cool. But what it really made me realize is that we really need to study issue campaigns in the way that bots are manipulated. Right now we're having a lot of discussions, for instance, about Planned Parenthood. And I've started seeing bots being used by people who are anti-Planned Parenthood or pro-Planned Parenthood to try to engage in conversations in a much more massive way than people could ever do it. And actually very realistically, which is pretty scary. So there's some topics for future research here, kind of things that we can think through. I've kind of come to the conclusion in studying bots that you can't just study bots with one field. Maybe this seems like a no-brainer to you guys, but in academics, a lot of times, people try to get at one thing from only one set of theory. And I don't want to be a dilettante, I don't want to try to do this at a surface level, but I've started having conversations with people in other disciplines. I've started chatting to this guy, Ryan Kalo, who's at University of Washington Law School, and we have decided we're going to look at the way bots might affect the law. And I was just telling Alice and Jesse about this. Basically what it is we started seeing all these bots, like I mentioned before in the US case, tweeting out pro-governmental propaganda. What happens when bots tweet out pro-governmental propaganda during election time? What happens when it causes coordination between super PACs and candidates? What happens when it makes things look in a completely different way than they actually are? So we're writing a paper on bots and campaign law. The different ways that candidates on both sides of the aisle, we actually have cases Democratic and Republican of them using bots to violate campaign finance laws, how they're breaking the law. And that'll be released in a couple months, hopefully. We'll see. And we have another venue, bots and public outreach, something I'm really interested in. How can we build better journalism bots? How can we use them as information radiators, like I mentioned before? How can we do protest bots in a better way? Or how can we better them? How can we create a list of them so that everyone can see how they're used, and then keep doing this and maybe make it good in a way that's not super spammy? And then bots for education. Can we use bots to send out information on different things? That gets a little tricky because it could be a lot more like spam, but how can we basically use bots to educate one another? The big thing for me is this idea of symbiotic socio-technical theory. Like, how do bots and humans have a symbiotic relationship? How do these technical actors interact with us? Because a lot of times they do things, like I mentioned before, that their coders don't intend. There's a case in the Netherlands about 8 months ago where a guy created a bot to be funny, and the bot was tweeting and tweeting and tweeting, but it was also scraping information from Google to learn new things to tweet. The guy just programmed it. Go on Google, go on Wikipedia, find new things that you can tweet about. The bot basically ended up making a death threat to someone on Twitter, saying, I'm going to kill you on Twitter. The police showed up at the guy's door, and they're like, sir, we see that you've made this bot that threatens to kill somebody. What's the deal? Like, is this you saying this? And the guy's like, no, I never had the intention of doing this. The bot kind of did it on its own, but he still built it. So you can see the legal issues there. You can also see the public problem there when it talks to people that it doesn't even know and starts making threats, or hate speech, for instance, maybe. We've seen that one happen. And you can also see how this like symbiotic, like socio-technical relationship happens, like when bots start to do things that we don't understand or we don't predict. And part of what's so fun about bots, I would say, like I don't know if you guys follow any bots on Twitter. There's a famous one called Horsey Books that turned out not to be a bot actually. But it was a great thing because what it did was tweet garbled messages that were sometimes just so weirdly spot on, but in really weird language in a way that only a bot could speak. And I know it's kind of weird because it turned out not to be a bot, but there's a lot of bots that are bots that do that. And that's kind of what we like. And so this is all getting at this question of how can we do what we're calling, what a group of people is calling ethnography of information. How can we think about bots and socio-technical actors in a more nuanced way, beyond just looking at deep hanging out of human communities? Because that's kind of what ethnography's tried to do for a really long time. Ethnographers just went into or they go into a community, and they basically hang out. They hang out with the people, and then they try to get information, and then they write about their experiences. They read about the interviews. They read about participant observation, what's going on. And digital ethnography has been something very similar. Basically, people going and hanging out with people on World of Warcraft. That's been done, by the way. And there's a couple books on people hanging out on World of Warcraft. It sounds like my dream dissertation, but too bad it's been done. So we want to take this one step further and look at the technical actors. And look at the technical actors in tandem with human actors. So I mentioned our website. It's politicalbots.org. And we have all the articles we've written in the last year or two. We have like sort of an about page. We have all that kind of jazz. We also have all the events that we're doing. If you ever want to come to a talk, we have a couple more in New York going on in the next 6 months. And also, guys, if you ever encounter a political bot, go there and nominate a bot. Seriously. Because this is really important information for people to know. If Carson starts using bots in his presidential campaign in 6 months, it might be manipulating public opinion, and you might be the one that finds that bot. So let us know. Thank you guys very much.
One question that I have, the first one is not super academic, but how do you see a bot? You said, oh, I've been seeing bots. So how do you see what a bot is?
That is a really good question. I wrote, I'm going to reference myself right now. I wrote an article for Tech Precedent, which is kind of a little bit defunct now, with Phil Howard about the different ways to spot a bot. And there's a lot of different simple ways, like it follows lots of people, but doesn't have any followers itself, or it tweets every 5 seconds. Like no one in there are some academics who, by the way, tweet every 5 seconds. Some of them are in my department, by the way. Not doing any names. But yeah, bots can be noticed if they tweet all the time. A lot of times they don't have a Twitter picture; they just have an egg. So, but they're getting much more sophisticated.
I was going to ask her, especially the political ones.
Oh,
I would
yeah.
expect them to be more sophisticated.
Yeah, they're getting more sophisticated. So, U.S. government actually launched a campaign like 2 years ago, and it was publicly advertised on their website for people to build bots and what they were calling persona management software. I mean, some of you might have heard of this, but basically what it does is they build a Facebook profile, they build a iTunes account, and then they build a Twitter page, and then they give it a picture, and they give it 100 pictures on Facebook and stuff. So it looks like a real person with a real life. So that's kind of scary, but there are still ways. Like machine learning is still at a stage where a lot of times the script that the bot writes looks kind of weird. Like there's some words that are off. And it also like sometimes uses characters you wouldn't expect. But I guess I gotta refer you to the article that we wrote to really get a feel for that, like
No,
step by step, yeah.
I am curious, it seems, especially when we talk about the US case, because at least that was the one that was more kind of counterintuitive to me, right? We might expect an oppressive regime to build bots, to do propaganda, to do that work, and just using a new tool. But if we're talking about US politics, okay, this becomes a little more interesting, or a little more, well, but in some ways.
Especially for us in the US.
Yes, exactly. I'm also problematically Americanist in my studies. But even then, I was kind of struck by how often the bots that you were talking about are doing things that campaigns were starting to have people do, basically. In 2010 or 2012, for instance, the follower bot thing that some campaigns kind of notably got in trouble for paying for followers in other realms, right? So kind of doing it a different secret way. And similarly, having campaign staffers or consultants tweet for them to go engage people and find them and seek them out. And I'm kind of curious to what the difference, what you think the difference is in a bot-driven world versus if it is the campaign staffer or a consultant who's not always saying, hey, I'm a member of the campaign, let's talk about them either.
Both happen simultaneously, like both are very much still happening. I don't know if you guys have heard or if you've heard about like China having a cyber army of troops, the 50 Cent army, or Israel having a big army of cyber troops to tweet pro-Israel content, or people in Russia doing the exact same thing in the Kremlin. New York Times, Sunday edition, New York Times wrote an article about the Kremlin and a troll factory at the Kremlin. And so I guess the difference now is sort of like the savvy people that have gotten sort of involved in campaigns. Full disclosure, I worked on the last Obama campaign for the data team. And there's some really, really smart people working for those teams. And the more savvy they are, the more they're able to educate the candidate. Because a lot of times the candidates don't really care or know much, but they're basically like, hey, we have a bunch of people that are sending out tweets on your behalf for the campaign, and I know that's kind of weird from the table, but what if we had the computer do it on its own? And so that's basically the general principle. Like maybe we could have a bot do it, what we call a bot, and then we can explain to the politician what that is. Maybe we could have a bot do it 50 times a day. Maybe we could have 1,000 bots do it 20 times a day. You know what I mean? So you start to see like how the effects really start to happen. And our hypothesis in this all is kind of like, if there's a crisis situation, if there's a contested election, we will see bots being used by campaigns, or by candidates, or by regimes. And it's basically held up over the last year. We've looked at nearly every single election that's happened that's been remotely contested, and there has been bots used.
That's interesting. Do you see that as a qualitative difference kind of in what that means then? If it,
Like how so?
an automated kind of series of being able to do it 50 times versus, getting 20 people who are here to be able to do it?
I mean, yeah, like at face value there is some difference. It depends like what the bot's programmed to do. So if the bot's programmed to tweet on behalf of the candidate, it might get a little bit monotonous and start to be identified as a bot, whereas people obviously can understand humor, they can understand sarcasm, they can do all sorts of things that a bot can do. Computers still have certain restraints. Like you can do as much big data analysis as you want, but a lot of times you might find that a lot of the things you thought were no's were actually yeses, and the person was being sarcastic. So you were looking on Twitter and measuring people's tweets and be like, this guy said no, or said, I love Hillary Clinton, but it was clear that this guy was being sarcastic. Well, bots kind of fall into that trap too. Like they can do sarcastic stuff, they can do tweets. Sometimes we think that bots sound sarcastic, and that's when they're maybe the most funny, but it's completely unintentional. Data in, output out.
Most of the actors that you were mentioning as kind of creating bots are major institutions, governments with lots of power, but you also said, okay, we saw this congressional bot, which I say congressional campaigns, super abnormal that a congressional campaign would be competent enough to do that.
I've worked for a couple,
there,
so I know that that's true.
And I mean, even at the Senate or federal level, we would assume, okay, that's pretty high movement, pretty well done campaign for them. So kind of, are you seeing this happen across the spectrum like that? Is it mostly a top going to trickle down thing?
It's actually not a top going to trickle down thing. It's surprising. It can be a lone person out there just that is a good coder that decides that they take up with a certain issue and they want to buy. You can buy 1,000 bots on Fiverr.com for $5. I mean, it's easy. and then they program it to do what they want to do. You can download script, even if you don't even know how to code, from GitHub, and get a bot that does anything you want it to do, basically. You don't have to be competent in coding. And I guess to answer your question a little bit more in depth, like, there's a case I love in the UK where, I can't remember the politician's name, but he was just a guy running for a seat as an MP, and he was caught using propaganda Twitter bots. It's in on this blog, Inside Croydon's covered a lot of this stuff in the UK, but it's happening in the US too. So it's like I said, I worked on some unnamed congressional campaigns, and the guy that was the communications manager on both of the campaigns that I can think of was also pretty damn good at coding on computers. And so he was doing a lot of this stuff on his computer. And that's when I first started to get interested in it, actually.
Interesting. And I mean,
Yeah.
especially the buying of thousands of bots or whatever,
Yeah.
that was almost exactly what was seen in kind of the early
Yeah.
development of how to use social media was, oh, we'll buy all of these friends, and that resulted in some really, really terrible unintended consequences in terms of bad numbers, and then kind of having to pay it for, or having to pay for it later down the road when you didn't know who you were sending your message to. But
Oh my gosh, totally.
I am curious if you did
It happens on
mention
both
unintended
ends, you know,
consequences,
like-
if you have any of those stories yet.
Well, I'm sure that there are ones out there. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but you can think of it on that side of it being you tweeting information out to a bunch of people who you don't know who they are, or who like might be behind the bot or something like that. Like, we all have followers on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you probably have bots following you, and you probably don't know who's behind the bot. Actually, the other day, I had 2 days ago, I had some really weird account follow me and start like kind of threatening me and stuff. And it had seen that I was doing work on political bots and using the hashtag and stuff, and it started kind of talking to me. And that's just one example of something weird happening on Twitter. It was
It did
like,
a lot
how
like
much
you
is
were
the
talking
Clinton
about.
campaign paying you? They kept asking me. I was like, if the Clinton campaign was paying me, I wouldn't be here, guys. I'm sorry.
Oh, but that is interesting. It looked
Yeah.
for a bot that would search out propaganda from humans, right?
Right.
Like the reverse. of-
Right, and it was completely garbled. It was obviously like a bot. It was either a bot or someone that was completely psychotic.
Yeah.
But like, it was a bot because it was using like, I mean, we did some work and
Yeah.
figured it out, my friend Nate. But anyway, that's one instance, but then there's other instances too, you know, like, part of the problems I think are problems for other people too. Like, we talk about the concept of like, Sam and I were talking about impression management earlier today, and what happens when someone has 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million bot followers? What does that do to the way people see them? And what does that do to their fame? What does that do to Obama? You know, he has 70% fake followers. And like, I worked on this campaign, but I still think that's not a very good thing to do.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and especially that in a Western democratic kind of, across all of them, that news articles get written about, people have the most followers. Like, that's a weird horse
Oh, they
race
totally
thing,
do.
but then
Yeah.
it gets you more coverage, and so that they are incentivized to get more followers.
Yeah, and I mentioned Newt Gingrich and how he had 95% fake followers, but he used to talk actively. There was instances of him saying, I have 10 million followers on Twitter.
Which is so
How
many more
do
than the
you
next
have?
guy.
Yeah, and everyone's like, okay, hold on a minute. And then some computer scientist is like, I'm gonna do an analysis of this and like figure out how many are fake.
Which also speaks to the kind of interesting intersection between institutional attempts to get followers by a campaign or a government or something like that, versus just these people who are perhaps doing it on their own as the one who is kind of hounding you, right? Who may or may not be attached to an institution, right? That a campaign might not want some crazy person making a bot that we know.
Yeah, and I think there's like an important point there about groups in general. Like, some groups, institutions are highly organized, and we can talk more about this another time, but like, groups like Anonymous that might build bots are not monolithic.
This week, right? There was a lot of talk about bots to take down ISIS. And to
Oh yeah,
to
that's
jam
exactly what I was
everything.
going to get into.
Yeah.
Like, Anonymous is not a monolithic organization, but Anonymous has been building bots basically to uncover ISIS accounts that you can download a bot and the bot will track, and like, you can fight against ISIS. And it might just,
And
for all we
that's the
know,
message too. You can fight
Yeah,
against
yeah.
ISIS without like
you
right by
can
pressing
fight
buttons.
against ISIS. But the idea here is like, who built that? Like, it could be one guy that thinks he's part of Anonymous, or it could be a group of like a subgroup of Anonymous, but there's no structure there really, you know? Who knows?
Yeah, and how much do you play into it once you are the one pressing the button to activate a bot or to pay $1 to activate it or whatever.
Yeah, and you know, this brings up a really important point. Like, something that's really crazy is that a lot of times people buy and build and send out bots to follow people that they don't like. And it happens in politics. During the Obama-Romney campaign, Romney got basically like 100 fake followers overnight. And of course, like, MSNBC was writing about it the next day. Like, You don't get 100,000 followers in 6 hours, right? And so a lot of people hypothesize that it was actually someone that didn't like Romney that did that to him, to make him look like he was trying to buy fake followers. So it happens both ways, you know? So if you want to discredit someone, you can basically buy a bunch of fake followers online and make them look bad, make them look stupid or vain, you know?
Interesting. Well, so I have some other questions, but I would like to open it up to you guys first before. Yeah.
You're talking about like how someone could just, you know, you can create a bot and then the bot could do something that you really, like you didn't expect it, like threaten someone. And then I was thinking about like when governments just like, you know, like they create bots, like for example Russia, they had like in a specific target and you know they thought about something very specific. And then in this other case about, you know, the threat, it was like something, you know, completely different. But then can you really like get someone and then blame them, you know, for, you know, creating a bot or then just asking someone to create a bot?
That's such a good question, you know, like, and I think it brings up a larger point, which is the fact that a lot of times we don't know who releases bots. Like, so I think you're getting at that point. And I think that a lot of times the reason people use bots is because they want them to be a substitute for themselves to do something that they wouldn't normally do as a person. And it's harder to track them back. Like you have to have some pretty sophisticated knowledge in order to track who built the bot if they don't want to be found. Especially if they have knowledge of IP addresses and how to change what they're doing and to cover all their tracks. In the case of the Netherlands guy where the bot issued a death threat, that one was pretty easily triangulatable, and like the guy, one of the reasons the guy didn't get into any trouble was because all of his information was there, you know? Like there was no, we talk about this kind of question of intent in the law, there's no real intent there, we didn't have intent. But what happens when you download bot code from GitHub that's built by that's been added upon by thousands of people, and you download that bot, then you launch it on Twitter, you have no idea what's going to happen, and most of the coders that had a hand in it don't really have an idea of what's going to happen. That's the nature of code. A lot of times, it's built upon it's all built upon each other, and so yeah, it's a hard question. It's a good question though, and it's something that lawyers need to start thinking about, and which they probably will because there's probably money in it.
I've done, for 2 companies, done like search engine optimization and, you know, trying to sort of nurture virality as well, sort of play to the internet and sort of like play that whole game. To what extent have you sort of seen evidence of like an if-then algorithm that somebody wrote sort of replacing an entire, you know, the entire advertising industry or the entire PR field just because so much of it's focused on the internet? And like you said, you know, one person sitting in their basement could write some, if this happens, then put out this, you know, information in, information out, and sort of do more than an entire PR firm could do.
Yeah, there's no specific case that comes to the top of my head that is about one person kind of doing that, but I will say, and what's really interesting, is that a lot of this bot stuff originates with advertising and PR firms. Bots are, advertisers and marketers are the ones that are using bots and that built the technology basically in the 90s. And so it definitely would be easy to like invade the conversation or like basically the information that's available on Google by, you know, having bots find it. It's just about knowing the structure. Yeah. And like my dream, and if you guys have any connections, maybe you do, is to get into an advertising conference, but they won't let me come because like I want to go to an advertising conference and like start interviewing people that build bots and be like, so do you guys, like, the crazy thing is that we learned about PR firms that were working for Nabisco or whatever, this is hypothetical, but they were also working for the Syrian government, you know? And that happens. I mean, Dave Eggers wrote a book about this kind of idea, which, yeah.
I am surprised. Have you been able to talk to? Sorry, I totally didn't take questions, but have you gotten kind of campaigns to talk about their use of bots, or has it mostly been the outside people saying, okay, this is a bot, or I created a bot that did this other thing?
In Turkey, I have, but it was really sketchy because they're arresting a lot of journalists right now, and I was there at the time, and so I find that a lot of times the people that are writing bots for campaigns, sometimes they are the communication managers or the communication people, but a lot of times they're just contractors who like are online on Mechanical Turk who get hired for a really small amount of money to build a bot.
And so those people we can't get at. And those
Yeah.
people have no vested interest in the campaign. They don't give a shit. They don't care like if the candidate is conservative or liberal. They just are doing work. And so they'll tell us everything we want to know. And that's a really interesting perspective. Actually, in the Turkish case, I had to cancel all my interviews like after having a chat via Twitter with one guy that was working for the PM of Turkey building these bots, and another guy that was working for the opposition party. And one of them told me, listen, like, this is a really bad idea, and I've kind of got the idea that maybe you'll get into trouble if you keep doing this. You should stop. And I was like,
Because of which one? Because of talking to the opposition or talking to the actual people spilling
because of
secrets?
talking to the people spilling secrets, but also to be talking to both. Because it looked like I was playing both sides, kind of. But I'm an ethnographic researcher, and my goal is to try to get the information, right? But they're going to treat me like any journalist that's primed for information, you know. And I worked as a journalist before I came to grad school, so.
More questions?
So clearly this raises, the bots raise a bunch of ethical issues. What do you foresee about the regulation of bots and whose responsibility that is? If it's Twitter's or like a legality issue?
Such a good question. This has been discussed so much in the academy and academia, like by people about like who should do the moderating. And it's been like sort of the view of the platforms like Twitter and Facebook to kind of take actually let's talk about Twitter. It's been the view of Twitter to take an approach of we're not going to take responsibility. They kind of want to treat themselves like a telecommunications firm, basically. Like whatever happens on Twitter is basically two people communicating. It's not our fault. But then again, it's kind of weird because then when they do want to promote an issue, they absolutely do. There's a guy named Gilad Lotan, if you want to look at his work. He's here in New York and he works for a company called BetaWorks, and he's written a bunch of articles about the ways that like Twitter does or does not judge content. And he's kind of argued that sometimes it just completely doesn't judge content. And so like you might think that something weird is happening, but it's not, or whatever. And so Facebook's a different story because Facebook does totally moderate bots, and it also changes its algorithm all the time. There's no way of like understanding the Facebook API, which is basically the tool you use to measure what's going on Facebook. Whereas on Twitter, you can log right in and build as many bots as you want as long as you're within their terms of service. As long as the bot doesn't tweet every 1 second or whatever their terms of service are, it changes all the time, then you're fine. So it changes from platform to platform. In my view, to get at your question, shoot, I don't know, you know, like it's a really difficult conversation to have, but I tend to think there's probably going to be policy that's going to be written about how this is used in the governmental context, and I think there probably should be.
Well, if it's used in political ways and that kind of transcends bipartisanship, like everybody is in favor of using it for political reasons, what's the probability that something like that is going to even get by in Congress if the Congress people are using it? They're the ones using it for their advantage.
That's a really good question. I mean, you're right. And maybe it'll happen on a more local level, I don't know, but it seems kind of unlikely when you put it that way, you know?
And then election communication is monitored a slightly different way than like just passing a law through Congress, so it might be different, but they are so terrible at legislating
Like
that they have
horrible.
not, they have, I mean, so like we were both talking about our failures with not lawyers up here. But that I've been really interested in how campaigns are using social media, and that largely they fail to regulate that. That the regulations they have put in place for things like Facebook ads have actually defaulted to the original law and saying, okay, you have to have disclosures like paid for by whomever has to have that in a Facebook ad.
Yeah.
But that the way the law was written was actually, no, just default to the original law. Do not account for social media in any new way or anything, right?
Yeah,
So like it worked out in that case to seem like it was actually legislating it, but the law didn't change, and that's a huge problem for Twitter. And that even when the Facebook ad, like the user interface changed, it made it so disclosure didn't happen on the front page in the same way, so that it's a huge problem, even if not the exact one that you pointed to, because the people making the laws would be the ones.
I've like talked to a lot of media lawyers who say something really similar, and a lot of communication scholars or people who study media across various other disciplines say the same thing. The law takes about like 15 to 20 years to catch up to what's going on in the media. Like, so we might all be using like Facebook or Twitter, but that doesn't mean that the Federal Election Commission has any kind of idea about what's going on. And a lot of times, law, like I was talking about how code is built upon itself, law is built upon itself too. So basically what you're saying, Jesse, is like they're referencing laws that were written in the 1920s to try to apply to Facebook, which is like absolutely crazy in my opinion. Like it's the equivalent of like putting people in prison via the Espionage Act, which was written like, things need to be updated, they need to be tied to the system.
Yeah, and that the very fact of law itself makes for precedent seeking, not forward looking. So the idea that, oh, we think bots will do this thing, so we ought to think how that they would be impacted or how the law should impact them is like,
Well, so part of the issue there too is like, it starts to look very like the Minority Report in some weird ways too, And I guess to speak about this is a bit of a tangent, but like, the New York Police Department, and it's been really well cataloged, the NYPD and the Chicago Police Department and several other ones, I can't remember the lady's name, Virginia Eubanks, has written on this. She's a scholar that's done some really cool work, and there's a documentary she's in that's about this stuff. Basically, they try to do predictive policing. They try to basically, they use like bots to do this. They like scrape the web for all this information on a person and see how many crimes their friends have committed, or if they're in an area that's it's likely that they'll commit a crime. Completely discriminatory, by the way, because where they end up showing up, they end up showing up in the areas that, like, the poor neighborhoods and stuff like that. And then they say to a person, this has happened, this is people who have been interviewed, and this has happened. They'll say, your friend committed a crime yesterday, your sister committed a crime 3 weeks ago, you live in this neighborhood, we're watching you.
or even you said something on Facebook,
Yeah.
but it wasn't actually a crime yet.
Yeah. Oh yeah, a thought crime or like something like that. You said something on Facebook, you insinuating.
I
And
lived
this
in
is kind
Chicago
of
for many years.
Did you?
That was very,
Yeah.
very touchy.
Oh yeah, and so I guess that goes on kind of a wild tangent, but it's just it's not super tangential because it's totally related to data. It's related to the way that data influences society, influences or does not influence our lives. So police departments might be able to use it in their favor, whereas Congress can't pass a law for 50 years.
Sorry to keep going on this point, but I think it's interesting that being that Twitter and Facebook, since they have certain regulatory policies that govern how people act on their platform, if there are political means that are happening and they're not being hashed out in like the legal system, but if Twitter were to make a policy that enforces and fixes this problem, then it's kind of like we have like a fragmented legal system where part of what's governing the social and like economic dealings and political whatever is part of that's run by Twitter in this marginal way, and part of it's run by Facebook. What I mean?
It's already happening, man. I
Yeah.
mean, like, corporations have a massive vested interest in the way that the law happens in this country, and Twitter and Facebook are among them. Google especially. And so it's really a really interesting thing to think about, but I think that Twitter tries to be really careful, because the minute they start judging content outright, they become liable. And then there's going to be lawsuits, like, this is the US.
But you're right that even those technical kind of, the institution of technical policies matters too. When Twitter shut down parts of its API, it disallowed people to use things like the Sunlight Foundation to tweet what politicians were doing. So that exactly what part of what you're saying is not only is it differently, that would Facebook's rules and laws be different than Twitter's, but in fact if that is space controlled not by the public interest, that in fact we might shut down some of the things that we should.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you guys. Thank you.